April 9th, 1992. Laughlin, Nevada. While on vacation with her fiancé Al Henderson, 59-year-old Jean Moore mysteriously vanishes after being dropped off at a casino. Al reports Jean missing, but the casino surveillance footage shows no sign that Jean was even there that day, and contradicts many aspects of Al's story. Investigators begin to wonder if Jean even arrived in Laughlin to begin with, and suspect her fiancé might be withholding information about her disappearance. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I will be covering a case which was requested by a listener named Mike, whom I have chatted with on Twitter numerous times and is a devoted fan of this podcast. It's a case which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries and involves the disappearance of a woman named Jean Moore. I'm quite happy to fulfill Mike's request and cover this one, because I feel it is somewhat underrated as far as Unsolved Mysteries cases go. Other than a few articles on newspapers.com, there really isn't much information about it available online. Unsolved Mysteries featured its fair share of spousal disappearances where someone went missing, and the spouse was the prime suspect. But this one is rather unusual because it involves an elderly couple, and on the surface, it does not seem like the type of relationship where you'd expect foul play. It's a pretty baffling mystery, and whether you believe the spouse in this case is innocent or guilty, there are a lot of things here which don't make much sense. I previously featured this case in an article I wrote for listverse.com, 10 Unsolved Casino Mysteries, which was originally published in July of 2015. I guess that's another odd aspect of this mystery, as you would not expect a person to just vanish without a trace from a busy casino in broad daylight. But we'll get into that momentarily. Before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes and 15 to 20-minute mini-sodes. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new mini-sode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music, so if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who's feeling generous and wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. I want to send a shout out to a new batch of donors this week, which include Emily, Kristen, and someone who goes by the name Eclipse, so a big thanks to all three of you. And since it's now February the 1st and a brand new month, I also want to thank those of you who have signed up for regular monthly donations, and they are Alice, Amber, Dawn, and Casey. Remember, you have the option of signing up for recurring monthly donations, or if you prefer, you can just make a one-time only donation through our website. Either way, we're very appreciative. So with all that out of the way, let us now analyze the baffling unsolved disappearance of Jean Moore. Our story begins in 1992. Our central figure is 59-year-old Jean Moore, a retired banker who lives in the town of Apple Valley, California, with her wealthy 70-year-old fiancé Al Henderson, who has built up a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. Jean has 2 adult children from her previous relationship, a son named Joe Hamilton and a daughter named Connie Christie, and she's been with Al for over 20 years at this point. In spite of their lengthy courtship, it was not until December of 1991 when Al finally proposed to Jean, and the couple are planning to get married sometime in the near future. On April 6th, Al and Jean leave Apple Valley and drive 150 miles for a brief vacation in the town of Laughlin, Nevada. Laughlin is located right next to the Nevada-Arizona border, about 90 miles away from Las Vegas, and it's a prominent casino and resort destination. The couple stayed at a hotel called the Colorado Bell and were planning to return home on April 9th. According to Al, Jean wanted to go to one of the casinos, the Flamingo Hilton, that morning to play what she considered to be her lucky slot machine before they headed back to Apple Valley. Even though there was a casino at the Colorado Bell, Jean had won $600 on this particular slot machine at the Flamingo Hilton the day before, and she wanted to try her luck again. At approximately 9:30 a.m., Al claimed that he and Jean drove to the Flamingo Hilton but could not find a parking space. So Al dropped Jean off at the front entrance, gave the car to a valet to park, and then turned the valet's claim ticket over to Jean. Al told Jean he would take a cab back to the Colorado Bell, and that when she was done playing the slots, she could use the claim ticket to pick up the car herself and meet him back at the hotel at around 11:45 or so. So Jean went into the casino and Al tried to hail a taxi, but he could not find one, so he decided he would head back into the casino to play the slots with Jean for a while to kill time. However, when Al went back inside, he was surprised to see someone else playing Jean's lucky slot machine. When this person left, Al decided he would take over the machine himself in order to hold it for Jean until she came back. He played the machine for about 30 minutes between 9:45 and 10:15, but Jean didn't return, so Al decided to leave the casino, and this time he was able to hail a cab back to the Colorado Bell. Al claimed he played some blackjack there until checkout time at 12:15, but Jean never showed up with the car. Al then took a cab back to the Flamingo Hilton and was surprised to discover that his car was still parked there. When Al spoke to the valet told him he never saw Jean and that no one ever gave him a claim ticket for the vehicle. It was here when Al started to become concerned. He searched around the entire casino but was unable to find Jean anywhere. Al finally decided to report her missing and worked extensively to find her. Over the next several days, he distributed over 4,000 missing persons flyers throughout Laughlin, offering a $25,000 reward for information. The words possible amnesia were written on the flyer, and Al feared that Jean might have suffered from some sort of memory loss and wandered off. Al also claimed that Jean was carrying between $600 to $700 on her at the time of her disappearance and wondered if she might have been the victim of a robbery. He even paid $1,200 out of his own pocket to charter a helicopter to fly over the vast desert area surrounding Laughlin, but they never found anything. However, no one came forward with any sightings of Jean or any information about her whereabouts. Jean's son Joe and her daughter Connie were skeptical about the idea that she was suffering from amnesia and seemed pretty skeptical about Al in general. In spite of the fact that he was with their mother for over 20 years, Joe and Connie never liked Al and often tried to convince Jean to end their relationship. One detail which seemed to bother them was how Jean had left behind her purse, jewelry, and engagement ring in the hotel room on the morning she disappeared, and they found it strange that she would have gone out without them. Well, sure enough, the police also became quite skeptical of Al, particularly after obtaining the Flamingo Hilton security tapes from the day Jean went missing and viewing the surveillance footage. Surprisingly, Jean did not show up in any of the footage at all. She could not be seen playing her so-called lucky slot machine or doing anything inside the casino. The footage did show Al driving up to the front entrance of the Flamingo Hilton that morning and walking into the lobby, but in the immortal words of the late Robert Stack, beyond this point, Al and the surveillance footage seem to disagree. There's no footage of Al giving the valet's claim ticket to Jean, and he is not shown playing Jean's lucky slot machine during the 30-minute period he claimed he was using it. Al tried to counter this by claiming that he did play the slots during this time period, and that the police must have been looking at footage of the wrong machine. However, when Al was searching for Jean, he told casino security that the machine shown in the footage was Jean's favorite machine and asked if they'd seen her there. So security confirmed with police that they were looking at the correct machine on the security tapes. And in addition to the surveillance footage contradicting Al's story, Al himself wound up doing the exact same thing on national television. Believe it or not, when Al sat down to give his interview for the Unsolved Mysteries segment, his story was different than the one he originally gave police. Instead of saying that he dropped Jean off at the casino's front entrance and gave her the valet's claim ticket there, Al now claimed that he dropped Jean off at a side entrance before driving around to the front and leaving his car with the valet. Al then said he walked into the casino, found Jean, and gave her the claim ticket before heading back outside again to find a taxi. Investigators found it troubling enough that they couldn't find any witnesses who could confirm that Jean was at the Flamingo Hilton on the morning of April 9th, but they became even more concerned when they had trouble finding corroborating evidence that Jean was even in Laughlin to begin with. Records from the Colorado Bell Hotel did confirm that Al checked in there at 1 p.m. on April 6th, and checked out on the morning of April 9th like he said he did. Records also showed that complimentary meals were listed for Al's room on the 6th, 7th, and 8th. Investigators did find a waitress who remembered serving Jean and Al at a coffee shop at the Colorado Bell on April 6th, but were unable to find any other witnesses who could place Jean in the Laughlin area during the next 3 days. Things got even more complicated when a witness came forward who claimed that she saw Al and Jean together at a gas station near their hometown of Apple Valley at around 4:30 p.m. on April 8th. The witness said she briefly interacted with Jean, who told her she was heading to Laughlin. Even though it's not uncommon for eyewitnesses to be mistaken about details like this, investigators seem to think this woman's sighting was credible, because she remembered stopping at the gas station while on her way to a school function which took place on April 8th. So with no witnesses placing Jean in Laughlin after April 6th, and one witness placing Jean in Apple Valley on April 8th, the day before she supposedly went missing, investigators began wondering if Jean even traveled to Laughlin at all, and suspected that Al's trip there might have been nothing more than an elaborate cover story. But in Al's defense, there was evidence supporting him here. On the evening of April 8th, 2.5 hours after Jean was supposedly seen at the gas station in Apple Valley, Al's bookkeeper, Geraldine Fender, said that Al phoned her from Laughlin. During the call, Geraldine claimed that Jean got on the phone for a brief moment to say hi, and was excited because she had won $600 on a slot machine earlier that day. Al's phone records did verify that this call took place at 6:59 p.m., and seemed to discount the possibility that Al could have been in Apple Valley at the time the witness saw him and Jean together at the gas station. Phone records also showed that Al made a call from Laughlin at around 3 o'clock that afternoon. The 200-mile drive from Apple Valley to Laughlin takes 3 hours, so if phone records place Al in Laughlin at 3 o'clock and 6:59, then it would have been impossible for him to be at that gas station in Apple Valley at 4:30. That being said, the phone records cannot explain the discrepancies between Al's story and the casino surveillance footage from April 9th, so he was never eliminated as a possible suspect. Apparently, Connie Christie accompanied Al into a motorhome he owned shortly after Jean's disappearance, and she saw tissues on the floor which appeared to be stained in red. The motorhome, Al's vehicles, and his home were all eventually searched by police, but no evidence of foul play could be found. Joe Hamilton also told authorities that shortly before Christmas, his mother had told him she was seeking legal counsel because there were problems between her and Al, but I'm not sure if this lead ever went anywhere. After the case aired on Unsolved Mysteries in August of 1995, it pretty much faded from the spotlight. Al Henderson passed away in 2001, but authorities never uncovered any hard evidence to implicate him in Jean's disappearance, and no trace of her has ever been found. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So like I mentioned earlier, Unsolved Mysteries featured its fair share of murder and missing persons cases in which the victim's spouse was the prime suspect, and they often agreed to be interviewed on the show to proclaim their innocence. A lot of the time, these spouses came off as very unlikable, and you didn't have a hard time believing they might be guilty. Al Henderson, on the other hand, didn't come across so badly in his Unsolved Mysteries interview. On the surface, he seemed like a nice enough old man, and it was hard to visualize this guy committing murder. This was one case where I genuinely wanted the spouse to be innocent. However, there's one big underlying problem here. Actual videotape evidence contradicts Al's story. That is a major red flag, and Al never came up with a reasonable explanation for such a major discrepancy. All that being said, this is still a pretty perplexing case. I think there's a lot of reasonable doubt about Al's guilt, because certain things here don't make much sense. Of course, just because Al was an elderly 70-year-old man does not mean he was not capable of murdering his spouse. In fact, Unsolved Mysteries once featured another case about a 70-year-old man named Joe Owens, who shot his 79-year-old wife several times and hid her body in a large compost box in his backyard. But that was a very unhappy marriage which had been troubled for decades, and pretty much everyone remembered Joe Owens as a mean, miserable old bastard who despised his wife. I'm just not sure what motive Al Henderson would have had to murder Jean Moore. They had been together over 20 years, and Al proposed marriage only a few months before her disappearance. Al was also a millionaire, and the couple was comfortably retired, so there didn't seem to be any financial gain from Jean's death. While it was established that Jean's son Joe and her daughter Connie did not like Al, they were both pretty vague about why. In their Unsolved Mysteries interviews, they mentioned that Al had a habit of putting Jean down in front of people, but that's the most extreme example they gave. There's no indication that there was any serious abuse in this relationship, or that Al and Jean were unhappy together. One piece of information which I've never found out is how the relationship ended between Jean and the father of her 2 children. I have no idea if the couple divorced, or if Jean was widowed, or what. But I do have to wonder if maybe Jean had an affair with Al while she was still with her previous spouse. If she decided to leave Joe and Connie's father to start a relationship with Al, then it's understandable why Joe and Connie never liked him. It would be very difficult to warm up to a person who caused your mother to leave your father, regardless of whether he was a decent person or not. I was unable to find any follow-up information on Joe's claims that Jean had been seeking legal counsel before Christmas because there were problems in her relationship with Al. I'm not sure I put too much stock in this, because Al proposed to Jean in December. It's not unusual that this would prompt Jean to meet with an attorney for, say, a prenuptial agreement, but if there were problems, I don't know why Jean would have said yes to the proposal to begin with, and then stayed with Al for another 4 months. Admittedly, it is pretty unusual for a couple to be together for over 20 years before they decide to get married, but I'm just not getting the vibe that this was a miserable relationship with any obvious red flags. On the surface, Al acted like you'd expect a person who was genuinely concerned about his spouse's disappearance to act. He remained in Laughlin for days afterwards, passing out thousands of missing persons flyers, paying money out of his own pocket to charter a helicopter, and offering a $25,000 reward. But of course, offering a reward isn't such a noble gesture if Al knows he'll never have to pay it out. In other words, there are plenty of places in the Laughlin area to dispose of a dead body. A guy can be very proactive about publicizing his spouse's disappearance if he knows for certain that her body will never be found and that no evidence will incriminate him. Let's provide some info on the geography of Laughlin. Like I said earlier, it's situated right next to the Nevada-Arizona border. To the west of Laughlin, there's miles and miles of vast open desert. To the east, there's the Colorado River, which separates Laughlin from nearby Bullhead City, Arizona. In other words, there are plenty of locations to get rid of a dead body. The Colorado Belle and the Flamingo Hilton, which is now called the Aquarius Casino Resort, are both located on South Casino Drive and are an 11-minute drive away from each other. The Colorado River is situated directly behind both establishments. One other piece of information I've been curious about is if Jean had any history of medical problems. Al's missing persons flyers had the words possible amnesia written on them, which made me wonder if Jean ever had any episodes where she lost her memory, became disoriented, and wandered off. Jean was 59 when she disappeared, which is still pretty young for someone to get Alzheimer's or dementia, but it does happen. If Jean suffered from memory loss and became disoriented and wandered out of the Flamingo Hilton, then it isn't completely implausible that she could have walked outside the city limits into the desert and died of exposure and her body was just never found. Or given how close it was to the casino, Jean could have also wandered into the Colorado River and drowned. I know Al chartered a helicopter to search the surrounding desert, but I'm not sure if anyone ever checked the river. Given the circumstances, a bout of memory loss and an accidental death seems more plausible than Jean being victimized by an unknown perpetrator. Since Laughlin is a gambling town, and people are often going to be carrying large amounts of cash on them, there's always the risk of someone falling victim to a robbery. But this scenario just doesn't seem to line up with Al Henderson's story. How likely is it that Jean would have been victimized by a random attacker inside a casino at around 9:30 in the morning? If Al had simply dropped Jean off at the casino and then went back to the hotel for the next few hours, then it's possible that Jean could have stepped outside the casino during that time period, where she was subsequently abducted and attacked by an unknown party. But the major problem is that after he last saw Jean in the casino, Al claims he went outside and attempted to hail a cab before he walked back into the casino only minutes later to discover that Jean wasn't at her lucky slot machine. Al then played the machine for the next half hour, but Jean never showed up, even though the only reason she made this extra trip to the Flamingo Hilton to begin with was to play that particular slot machine. So if you believe Al's story, something had to have happened to Jean in a very narrow time frame between when he gave her the valet's claim ticket and went looking for her inside the casino only minutes later. If Al was telling the truth about dropping Jean off at a side entrance which wasn't covered by a security camera, then I guess it's possible that Jean could have been abducted from that location without anybody seeing anything, but Al claimed he saw Jean again only a few minutes later to give her the claim ticket. When would there have been an opportunity for someone to abduct Jean without attracting attention? If Jean was hit with a sudden episode of memory loss and wandered away from the casino, then it would have had to have taken place immediately after Al walked away from her to find a taxi. I just don't know what could have happened to Jean during such a short amount of time which caused her to disappear forever. Now, one of the biggest issues in this case is the uncertainty about whether or not Jean even made it to Laughlin to begin with. It's apparent that the investigators and Jean's children were toying with the theory that Al murdered Jean at another location, disposed of her body, and then traveled to Laughlin for the sole purpose of fabricating a cover story about her disappearing inside a casino. Well, let's look at the timeline. We know for certain that Al checked into the Colorado Bell on April 6th, and he had to have been there for the next 3 days, since complimentary meals were listed for his room on the 6th, 7th, and 8th. The only witness who remembered seeing Jean was the coffee shop waitress on the 6th, but given that eyewitnesses can often be mistaken about what they see, it is possible she could have seen someone else other than Jean, or just saw her there on another date. Personally, I'm not sure I find it unusual that investigators couldn't find any other witnesses who remembered seeing Jean in Laughlin during this 3-day period. Thousands of people pass through this town every day, and in a casino, folks are generally going to be so focused on their gambling that they might not take note of the other faces in the building. So just because no one remembered seeing Jean does not necessarily mean she wasn't there. It doesn't sound like investigators were able to spot Jean on any surveillance footage either. Ordinarily, that would probably be like finding a needle in a haystack, but according to Al, Jean won $600 playing a specific slot machine at the Flamingo Hilton on the 8th. I know they didn't see any footage of Jean playing that machine on the morning of the 9th, but I'm not entirely sure if they checked the security tapes of that machine on the 8th. That being said, I've seen snippets of this casino security feed in the Unsolved Mystery segment, and it's not exactly the best quality, so trying to pick out Jean in 3 days' worth of grainy surveillance footage might not have been feasible. The biggest source of confusion is the witness who claims she saw Al and Jean at a gas station near Apple Valley at 4:30 p.m. on April 8th, and heard Jean say she was heading to Laughlin. Investigators seem to put a lot of stock into this sighting because the woman was heading to a school function on that particular night, and if she was telling the truth, then this leads credence to the theory that Jean never made it to Laughlin and Al murdered her somewhere else. But I don't know, I really don't think this witness's sighting is accurate. I'm not saying it didn't happen, I just think the witness got her days mixed up and actually spoke with Jean at the gas station on a different date. Even though authorities believe this woman's statement was credible, we do have phone records placing Al and Laughlin on that same day, and given the 3-hour distance, it doesn't seem possible for Al to have been in Apple Valley at that particular time. And of course there's also Al's bookkeeper Geraldine Fender, who claims she spoke to Jean in Laughlin during a phone call at 6:59 p.m. that night, and that Jean sounded like she was in great spirits. Admittedly, when I heard that Al's bookkeeper was the biggest witness supporting his story, I initially took that as a red flag, and wondered if maybe Al paid her off or something to provide a false story about speaking with Jean. However, during Geraldine Fender's interview on Unsolved Mysteries, she comes across as this sweet, grandmotherly lady, and I have a hard time visualizing her lying to law enforcement in order to cover up a murder. So I have no reason to believe she's not telling the truth, and I do think it's likely that Jean was alive and in Laughlin on the evening of April 8th. Hotel and room service records seem to verify that Al was in Laughlin on the 6th, 7th, and the 8th. It just seems odd to me that Al would travel to Laughlin on the 6th, stay there for 2 days, and then make a 6-hour round trip from Laughlin to Apple Valley back to Laughlin just to pick up Jean. So yes, I do believe that Jean was probably in Laughlin during that entire 3-day period. So if Al did murder Jean, it would have happened sometime between when she spoke to Geraldine Fender at 7 p.m. on April 8th and when Al arrived at the Flamingo Hilton at 9:30 a.m. the following morning. But what could have possibly happened during this 14-hour window which would compel Al to kill his spouse of 20 years? But putting aside motive, let's look at the logistics. Where could the murder have taken place? Because if Jean was killed inside her hotel room, then I really don't see how a 70-year-old man could have sneaked her body outside without anybody noticing. It seems likely Al would have had to take Jean somewhere more secluded to kill her, but how would this have happened? Given the apparent lack of motive, I'm more inclined to think this wasn't premeditated murder and that Al killed Jean by accident. Maybe they got into a fight and Al struck Jean, causing her to fall over and hit her head or something. But if this occurred, then it probably didn't happen in the hotel room. There are a lot of isolated spots in the desert where Al could have disposed of Jean's body, and he certainly would have had enough time to do so. But again, we're talking about a 70-year-old man here, and going out into the middle of nowhere to get rid of a body would not be the easiest thing for him to do. I know that Jean's daughter thought she saw some bloody tissues in Al's motorhome, but I'm inclined to think those are unrelated to Jean's disappearance. We know Al traveled to Laughlin by car, and there's no evidence his motorhome was anywhere near the town, so I don't think Jean's body was ever in there. One detail which baffles me is the fact that Jean's purse and her engagement ring were left behind in the hotel room. It does seem strange that Jean would not take them with her, but if Al was responsible for her disappearance, then it's also strange that he wouldn't have gotten rid of them to lend credence to his story. Really, when you eliminate the surveillance footage evidence from the Flamingo Hilton, I would be inclined to think Al was completely innocent, but that considerable hole in his story is difficult to ignore. Now, given Al's advanced age, I could cut him some slack and assume that maybe the inconsistencies in his story are the result of memory problems. Maybe he dropped Jean off at a different casino and got mixed up about which one she was at, which is why she doesn't show up in any of the surveillance footage. However, the footage does show Al driving up to the front entrance of the Flamingo Hilton and walking into the lobby at the exact time he said he did, so I think it's unlikely he dropped off Jean someplace else. It's also possible that Al got mixed up about which slot machine was Jean's lucky machine, which would make sense, but even if that was the case, shouldn't Jean show up somewhere in the casino's footage? It's also troubling that Al told a completely different story to Unsolved Mysteries than he originally told the police. Remember, he initially said that he dropped off Jean at the front entrance and gave her the valet's claim ticket, but then claimed in his interview that he dropped her off at a side entrance and met up with Jean and gave her the ticket inside the casino a few minutes later. Granted, Al's Unsolved Mysteries interview took place about 3 years after the fact, so it is possible he simply could have misremembered how everything went down. But I don't know, it sounds to me like he was revising his story in order to cover up the holes. The Unsolved Mystery segment contains the original footage of Al pulling up to the front entrance and walking into the lobby with no sign of Jean anywhere. So Al might have decided to concoct a new story about dropping Jean off at a side entrance, which didn't have any surveillance cameras, in order to explain how she entered the casino without showing up on any of the footage. He probably hoped he'd be able to slip this lie through without anyone noticing he changed his story, but Unsolved Mysteries flat out called him out on this. But even without the video evidence, there have always been aspects of Al's story which seem strange to me. If Al had to return to the hotel after dropping Jean off at the casino, I'm really not sure why he needed to go to the trouble of having a valet park the car, giving Jean the claim ticket, and then taking a taxi back to the hotel. Why not just drop Jean off, drive back to the hotel yourself, and then return to the casino after checking out in order to pick her up? Al spent the rest of the morning playing blackjack at the casino at the Colorado Bell, and you might be asking why he didn't just stay at the Flamingo Hilton and play blackjack there, which would have saved him the trouble of picking up Jean later. Well, Al's reasoning is that he was a regular guest at the Colorado Bell, and since they often gave him complimentary rooms and meals, he thought it was better to do his gambling there. But I don't know, that explanation does sound a bit weak to me. And I also find it strange that Al decided to take a taxi from the hotel back to the Flamingo Hilton. Al said that Jean planned to pick up the car and drive back to the hotel to meet him at around 11:45. But by the time he checked out at 12:15, she hadn't shown up, so he decided to travel to the casino to meet her. Granted, Jean was a half hour late by this point, but I'm just surprised that Al wouldn't have waited around longer for her to show up. Remember, casinos are notorious for not having any clocks on their walls, so that people can get so immersed in their gambling that they lose track of time. Jean being a half hour late shouldn't have been that much of a cause for concern. And if Jean decided to drive back to the hotel before Al arrived at the casino, then they would have missed each other and caused all sorts of confusion. I know this was 1992 before everyone could just communicate with each other by cell phone, but it just seems more logical that Al would have waited longer for Jean at the hotel. Quite frankly, most of Al's activities on the morning of April 9th come off as someone attempting to fabricate an alibi for themselves. I think the reason he decided to go to the trouble of having the valet park his car was so that the valet could function as a witness to verify his story. Al then spends the morning traveling back and forth between the casino and the hotel in order to get himself seen by people, so that he'll have an alibi for the time period in which Jean supposedly disappeared. But the only problem is there is no evidence that Jean was ever at the Flamingo Hilton to begin with, and the surveillance feed directly contradicts Al's story. You might be wondering why Al would even provide a story which could be so easily refuted by video evidence, but given that he was an older man, maybe Al underestimated just how much surveillance video there is at casinos. Now, I don't know if there's any significance to this, but Al's final statement during his Unsolved Mysteries interview has always struck me as a bit odd. He says, "I think that my net worth has gone down from around 2.5 million to 1 million. If I could get her back, I'd give the whole 1 million. I would do anything to get her back." So is Al implying that he spent 1.5 million in his efforts to find Jean? If that's true, then that would strongly point towards his innocence. But if not, then what's the point in even mentioning your net worth? This makes me wonder if Al was experiencing some financial problems at the time of Jean's disappearance, which could have possibly been related to some sort of gambling addiction that caused him to drop large sums of money at the casino. Maybe Jean found out about this during the trip, which ultimately led to a confrontation with Al that ended with him killing her. I have no evidence to support this theory, but it's the closest thing I have to a motive which would explain why a 70-year-old man would suddenly decide to murder his spouse of 20 years. This case is a weird contradiction. I couldn't tell you how or why he committed this crime, but if I had to lean in one direction, I'd have to say that Al Henderson is guilty of causing Jean Moore's disappearance. There are some points which favor Al's innocence, but I ultimately can't overlook the fact that concrete video evidence refutes his story. It seems pretty clear that Al is lying about the events which took place on the morning of April 9th, 1992, and I don't see why he would do that unless he was responsible for Jean's death. This is a pretty baffling and frustrating case, and I don't think I can come up with a concrete theory about what exactly happened, but my gut tells me that Al did it. On the surface, it doesn't make much sense for Al to murder Jean, but it also doesn't make much sense for a woman to vanish without a trace from a crowded casino at 9:30 in the morning. But of course, Al passed away in 2001, so if he really was responsible, then this case might be unsolvable. However, I would still love to get closure, so if you have any information about the unsolved disappearance of Jean Moore, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own personal theory about what happened, I'd love to hear from you. So feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. I want to thank all my loyal listeners and supporters out there, especially those from the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. A big thank you to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and of course a big shout out to Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next time for a brand new mini-sode of The Trail Went Cold.